Nature Breakthroughs with Dr. Wild Ben Goldman. Conversations with changemakers in a world gone mad. To discover what you need for personal, organizational, and societal change, get your free download of 3 ancient rituals smart entrepreneurs use to bounce back from shifts in the market and inside themselves. Go to www.naturebreakthroughs.com.
Yes, you pull them till they bite down. On the lies that you built from my doubt. I don't want money, I don't want cars, I just want to be free.
Okay. Joel Tauber, artist, activist, filmmaker, how are you?
I'm doing great, Ben. It's a pleasure to meet you, and it's a pleasure to be on your podcast. I really look forward to our conversation, and yeah, it's great to see you.
Well, welcome to Nature Breakthroughs, conversations with changemakers in a world gone mad. And we talk with all different kinds of people about change in the world. I have a topic, I guess, that I want to explore with you based upon the impetus for this show, which is a film you made called Border Ball, about the U.S.-Mexican border and things happening there. And this will have to be a kind of little bit of a conceptual artwork, because I found out yesterday that people can't actually see the film right now, although they may in the future at various festival stops. So we're going to talk about, but it'll just be kind of a lead in, I think, to talking about borders and immigration and kind of really diving into that. But to start off, why don't we, well, let me just say that we're recording this on Cinco de Mayo, yes, which I kind of looked up in preparation for this, and I didn't know much about it other than what I've learned is that it's celebrated more in the United States than in Mexico, but it marked the Battle of Puebla, which was when the Mexicans actually defeated a much larger imperial army of Napoleon. And one of the interesting facts about it is apparently it's the last time an imperial power from Europe invaded the Americas. And, so that's kind of resonant with another border conflict that's happening now with an imperial power invading another. And then, one of the things that I also want to weave into our conversation is, we have a few things in common, even though we've never met each other. You're wearing a hat, so I don't know if you're bald or not, but I can see you have a beard. Both like middle-aged, bald, bearded artists and Jews. And in reading your history, I saw that you grew up in Brookline. I'm talking, but whatever. I'm going to let you talk in a second. Which
talk
is
as much as you want. It's good. Yeah.
Well, I conduct these more as conversations, so I got plenty.
Totally.
And I lived in Brookline, and I noticed you grew up there, and you went to a Jew, like an Orthodox Jewish school.
Yep.
Yeah. So you have much more connection with with Judaism, I think, than I do. And but I just, one story about Brookline, I moved to Boston for a job that I had up there, actually working at an activist organization, which connects to that part of your life. And I didn't know where to live, so we had a realtor, and I basically, grew up in West Philadelphia, lived in East Village, New Orleans. So I've always grown up in very diverse areas, and I just said, we like diversity, so but she looked, I know, in retrospect, I realized what this person did was they saw my name, Ben Goldman, and they said, oh, you want to live in Brookline. And I didn't understand the significance of that until we lived there. And I found out how little diversity was there compared to where I had moved from, but that it's the, I guess, considered like the Jewish neighborhood of Boston in a way, or at least one of them. So that was kind of interesting. But I want to bring the whole Jewish thing into it, because you not only mention the relation, the echo of the detention camps on the border with the
Right.
Holocaust concentration camps, which
Right.
I'd like to discuss with you.
Yeah.
But it's, I think the relationship of Jews to borders and immigration is kind of under talked about subject, and I think it's consciously and subconsciously, or just kind of in the bones of you as an artist in producing this work. So tell us, what is Border Ball, the movie,
Okay.
and
Well,
what inspired it, and what's it all about?
all right. Well, so many things that you just brought up, and love to talk about all of them. Maybe I just like to say that this whole idea of change, I mean, that's one thing that's always constant in this idea of thinking about refugees and immigration, which is a kind of change, and people moving, we're always moving, people having to move from one place to another, and thinking about a relationship to my Jewish roots and my grandparents my paternal grandparents who survived the Holocaust. And they were living in Hungary for about a really long time, for 500 years. So that's not so transitory in a way. But, my grandfather's brother died in a slave labor camp. So I was, that's something, I remember looking at Holocaust footage when I was 6 years old at the Jewish school.
Can I just ask, how do you know they were there for 500 years? Oh, because they were rabbis.
Well, there's a lot of rabbis in my family. So, I have a beard and I'm bald, but I'm not 500 years old. So I don't have first person accounts, but that's family. That's what we think in our family. And, it's hard to know for sure if that's true, but, like many Jews, they left Spain in the Spanish Inquisition. And my family, my dad's side went to Hungary, and they were there a long time. And then, the Nazis came and everything. Everything's really bad. And, now we got some fascism again over there. So.
Well, I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but a couple things.
Yeah.
One is, because I'm just very turned on, very excited to talk about this stuff with you, is, there's kind of two major tribes, you may know more about this and disagree or whatever, in modern Jews, which is the Ashkenazi, and I don't know if they consider themselves tribes, and the Sephardim. And one thing, and it sounds like you have Sephardic roots from Spain, and
I think that's true.
One thing that's interesting about that, of course, is that there's a whole bunch of Jews that probably were in addition to Hebrew, Spanish speakers. So when you're talking about the U.S. border, you probably go back maybe hundreds of years. Your family may, for hundreds of years prior to coming to America, have been, quasi-native Spanish speakers.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
Well, actually, that would have been before the 500 years if they were
right. And and there's so many connections. I'm always struck by how many connections there are in many different ways. And Spanish is a language that I should have known earlier. I learned it really when I started thinking about this project, and my Spanish, I understand a good amount, but I'm not as completely fluent. I mean, I'm quasi fluent. But I think the idea of language and thinking about that, and also how languages change, that's also, I think, the idea of change is important, but it's also, I think, the idea of connection. And the idea of connection is one of the reasons why I began this project, thinking about the immigrants that we're locking up in our detention centers here. And it's happening everywhere. It's not just happening at the border. So I was looking at this, it's happening I'm sure there's one close to where you are. There's probably where you are. There's one close to where I am. There's a map of detention centers. Freedom for Immigrants has it. And so I was just thinking about that. And, I'm not a refugee from Guatemala or from Mexico or El Salvador or from anywhere. Well situated here in the United States. You know, after my family did get here, my mom's side was here longer. Polish Russian roots on my mom's side. So I'm not a refugee. I'm not in the detention center, thankfully, but I'm aware of how horrible it is when we're locking up people who need help. And that's partly because I think that whatever is happening to anyone anywhere, or whatever pain is happening to anyone anywhere, we're all connected and we feel it in some way. And I also think this idea of connection, and I think change is connected to that too, because everything is changing and we're all connected. And so therefore, I think there's a kind of responsibility and to try to take action. So I was thinking about this a lot. And, you know, you remember the march in Charlottesville that happened, you know, during our previous presidency, and people were shouting. I mean, Jews thankfully have not been rounded up into detention centers here, but it's bringing flashbacks, especially when I was hearing, you know, the marches yelling, killing Jews and Black people, African Americans, right here in Charlottesville. I live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I've got 2 young boys, and I've got cousins in Hungary now, and the anti-Semitism there is through the roof. And I know Jews are getting beaten up there and blamed for all kinds of absurd things. And so I just, you know, the idea of trying to think about that and trying to do something. So what I did was, a little bit before the pandemic, I decided to do a pilgrimage, a 40-day pilgrimage. And I walked every day from the Otay Mesa port of entry, which is near San Diego. And I lived in LA for about 12 years. So that was part of the border that felt most familiar and that felt I was most connected to. So, and I wanted to walk from there, and I did walk from there every day for 40 days, like 40 days Mount Sinai, trying to bring this ethical dimension in and frame and what we're doing there in terms of ethics, and in terms of also in terms of a religious context, because this is such a Christian culture in so many ways. So I wanted to try to bring that in. I was walking from the port of entry along the border wall, and then up to one of the detention centers, the Otay Mesa Detention Center, and back every day. So 7 miles, and then really more like 9 miles, and from where, you know, I was sleeping. And so walking every day, seven miles on this route. And I was wearing a baseball uniform, a custom-made baseball uniform in blue, white, and red. So I'm a Jewish guy. I'm also a white guy. And I wanted to wear a uniform that was different than the other uniforms that people might have been encountering at the border from Border Patrol, or in hopefully not detention center guards, but people for customs, people, Border Patrol. There's different kinds of uniforms and different kinds of agents for our country there. And I was wearing another kind of uniform, and I was talking about diversity and compassion. And I was going up to people and I was inviting them to play catch. And I wanted to bring this idea of openness, this simple act of playing catch, of coming together as equals, exchanging information, broadcasting people's stories, and coming together as equals, and trying to create community in a place that's we've marked with division. And so this idea of playing catch as equals, this idea of openness, like a big green field, or the way that we come together at a park and we might be able to play or interact with strangers. I wanted to foreground those ideas and celebrate a version or a vision of our country that I think so many of us believe in. And I met all these people, and I was talking with them, and I was filming them, and became both a movie, a 20-minute movie. And as you mentioned, it's on the film festival circuit. There's screenings pretty often. We just had one just recently at Art Center College of Design, where there's also a sculptural video installation of the project. So there's 9 short videos, and at the Williamson Gallery, this is in Pasadena in California, and people walk in and there's 9 videos and the video equipment that tells the story that plays the videos, and they form a baseball field. So you walk in, it's interactive, it's this large space, I think it's 4,600 square feet, and there's a pitcher's mound of dirt, and there's a video there that tells the story of my journey. And then there's 8 other videos, 4 on the infield diamond as iPads, 3 as projectors, like as outfielders. There's 1 like as a catcher and monitor, and they're all sharing stories of some of the people I met along the way. So sharing many of these stories and trying to talk about some of the sad things, and there's also some hopeful things, but also some sad and very problematic things that are happening there, and trying to talk about it in both broadcasting people's stories directly, but also trying to create poetry in relationship to this, to make it more, to try to frame it in a way that's both perhaps easier to contemplate and also that juxtaposes different aspects of our culture that I'm hoping will help challenge and question what we're doing down there. And so that's, you know, I can talk about this for a really long time, but that's a summary. And that show at Art Center is up through June 4th.
You know, there's 2 things I want to ask you. One is kind of minor, the other's major. Minor one is I noticed, well, first of all, you were using baseball as a big metaphor, and you had a lot of scenes where you were just kind of tossing the ball to yourself and calling it like a meditation. But I noticed you never looked at the camera, which I wondered if that was like, there was a reason for that. You were narrating so we could hear you talk. Yeah. So it was you talking to the audience, but you weren't looking at the audience. So I thought that was interesting. And then the other thing that struck me, I mean, a lot of things struck me. Well, let's say there's 2 other things that struck me, both of which I think are more major. One is, you know, of course, there's a big difference between a detention center on the border, a detention center, let's say, and, you know, the Russians have what they call filtration centers, where they divide up the captives between like women and children maybe, and men that they imprison, and men that they send back to anyway, they filter the men for different roles. And then, you know, a concentration camp where the purpose was to kill everybody. And clearly, you know, even if there are issues with the conditions at the detention centers, that's not why the United States has them. And so that kind of leads me into another observation, which is I didn't see in the movie. It seemed like everyone that you spoke to were I think everyone was an immigrant. Maybe there was someone that wasn't, but I didn't hear. It seemed like everyone was very much on one side of the border. The border that I'm talking about is like, let's call it like an ideological border or perspective. And there was no conversation with anyone that kind of, let's say, profoundly disagreed with your take. And I just want to play you this tape because these things are happening in real time.
Yeah.
And this is a conversation. I'd love, you know what, maybe I can even, I think I'm going to even show the video if I can do it quickly enough, and I can edit out the
trailer.
No, not your video.
Else. This is another video. Yeah.
All right, opposite of your video.
All right, I see it.
Here, listen.
I'm Kay Ivey. If Joe Biden keeps shipping illegal immigrants into our states, we all gonna have to learn Spanish. My message to Biden: no way, Jose. That's why I sent National Guard troops to protect the southern border. And that's why we banned sanctuary cities in Alabama. The left can try to counsel me, I don't care. But here in Alabama, we're gonna enforce the law.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm glad you brought that up. Keep going. What
Well,
were
I
you saying?
just, you know,
Yeah.
I can tell you that when I look at the smirk on her face, I feel repulsed by that, and maybe I should be more neutral. A lot of people repulse me, not just Republicans. I have a lot of aversions, but you know, she's the governor of Alabama, and there obviously, so she's not the only governor with that kind of perspective. There are a lot of people that have that perspective, and in a way it's absent. It's a silent partner in your film.
So, all right, I think you're bringing up a number of really great points. So let me just respond to the easy one first, and let's get into the bigger one. So so in terms of like cinematic strategies, like right now, like on Zoom, we're looking directly at each other, and then the viewer is sort of, we're looking at them too in a way. So it's a different kind of relationship, and I think we're used to that, like with the language of Zoom and also YouTube videos. I think many films, including Border Ball, the camera is not addressed directly because I think it pulls people out. The theory is it pulls people out of the idea of the story, and calling the apparatus or the camera in sort of is like, oh, this is a movie, and sort of pulls people in. So I think the relationship there, I'm talking directly to the people playing catch with, I'm looking at them, they're looking at me, they're sharing their stories, they're looking directly at me. And I think the camera is functioning as the viewer then is sort of standing right nearby and hanging out like nearby, but it's not like as direct, like staring at them. It's sort of like a close friend, the viewer's a close friend, family member hanging out and is right there with there. So I think a lot of filmmakers use that kind of strategy, and I think it's different than when we see it, like in terms of things that are also for the big screen. I mean, I think it's different strategy than on Zoom or on YouTube, and that's interesting. And you know, maybe like because YouTube and Zoom is, we're seeing that so much more. Maybe we're going to see more of that in like in films for the big screen too. I'm pulling my professor, my theory hat on, because I also teach filmmaking at Wake Forest University. So I like to think about this kind of stuff. So in terms of like the strategy of like looking slightly off and not the camera, that's I think using a more traditional cinematic strategy there. Okay, I think it's really, I think you brought up a number of big points. So first of all, yes, absolutely. There's bad stuff, very bad stuff happening at the detention centers, but they're not concentration camps. They're not intended to kill people. So there's a big difference. There's degrees of problems. I mean, when I was at the detention center there every day, and there's these 3 layers of barbed wire, and thanks for watching the film. And I was thinking about the Holocaust a lot because it's just so ominous, and there's people in jumpsuits, and we are doing bad things, but there's no gas chambers, you know, but there is forced labor. There is physical abuse that's happening. I don't know if it's happening to everyone all the time. I'm sure that's not the case, but it is happening. There's sexual abuse too. And there are people who are there for a really long time and they're dying. And there's detention centers, there's detention problems and refugee issues all over the world. It's an international issue. Yet, unfortunately, we have the oldest detention system in the world. We have the largest detention system in the world. And so it's a problem, and it's been going on for a long time. It was happening before the Trump presidency, and it was happening, and it's happening now. And so I talked to, okay, now in terms of like different sides and different thoughts about this, I talked to a lot of people. I talked to Border Patrol people for a long time, many of whom I formed long relationships with, talking with some of these people over the course of many days.
My assumption was that they didn't want to be in the film.
That's right. I wanted them to be on camera, but they weren't allowed to. And I talked to one of the head people, and he couldn't get permission either, or DC decided they didn't want to. Because I got permission from everyone also, because I think, which is indicative of that we really do believe in this kind of freedom of speech and advocating differences of opinion. And I wanted to talk to people from all sides. That said, the stories that I wanted to foreground were more first person accounts for the most part of people who were there and experiencing it. And I think people were experiencing it. It's hard to be like pro detention center and to be really ruthless about in terms of who comes into this country, or it's hard to have a position of extreme strictness even in terms of paperwork if it's someone who's literally walking back and forth every day, or is separated from, not able to see one's mother because of different papers, or has a brother locked up in a detention center. I talked to Alan Martinez, and he was so devastating listening to his account of his brother who's locked up in this detention center. And, or there were also people who had family members locked up who were talking with me, but couldn't talk to me on the camera because they were worried about pushback or punishment for themselves or for the family members who were locked up. And I definitely talked to people who were like, yeah, let's, who were advocating some really harsh treatment. And I photographed and filmed everybody. And there's baseball card images of 55 of the people that I talked to in the show. But I had to make a choice about which stories to foreground, even though I was talking to lots of people.
There were people that were in favor of the border policies. I was going to say,
sure.
I wondered if you would have to leave the border to find those people.
No, there were Republicans crossing the border that I was talking to. But, I try not to think about it, and there's Republicans who are against what we're doing at the border, and there's Democrats who are for, and again, so I try not to think about it in terms of party. I wanted to try to frame it in terms of ethics, although certainly it seems like one of our parties is much more militant, like one of the videos you just showed us, in terms of how we're acting at the border. I just feel like a goal of mine was to try to talk to people with differences of opinion and play catch with them and engage in conversation. And I definitely was doing that. But then I also, and so on one level, I view this as like a 3-stage art project. On one level, there was the action, this performance, this pilgrimage, and these interactions with all these different people. And that was creating conversation, and also, having a bit of a debate with some people, and including with some border patrol. We really got into things, but it was all very cordial, and we were just talking about it. And I think there's a lot of people who work at the border who do want to do the right thing, who are struggling, trying to figure out to do the right thing, and including people who work at the detention center too. And I think we're all complicit in some way. So I just think, so there was this conversation, but then there's the movie, and they're offering an opinion. And so I'm going to foreground some of the stories that I believe in, or I believe in pushing for. So I'm not, there's no pretense that this is showing every side. I'm not going to show a hardcore racist position, for example. And so, and I think a film can certainly do that. I mean, it's not pretending to offer every opinion. There's certain positions that I feel that I want to foreground that are not perhaps being foregrounded enough. So that's what I'm trying to do there.
Yeah, no, and I get this artistic license, and also the distaste of including in your work ideas that you may disagree with. But I also think, in a way, when we talk about the border, the real border, interesting to say it that way, is the different ideas. And one thing that really kind of brought that out in your film was, there was an old Mexican lady who said something like, I remember when it was just a rope across the road,
Yeah.
and it was like a little lady sitting on a chair, and people would hop over the rope out of respect for her or something. Maybe 50 years ago or something she's talking about, or and that, you know, so the difference between that and what we have now isn't the border, isn't the physical border. It's the policies that have been created to construct, well, physical and legal and human barriers that are based upon, you know, these very different sets of ideas, and it's rooted in I mean, there's so many things I want to say about this. It's rooted, of course, in nationalism, and you know, the one thing is, of course, the history of that region and how things between Mexico and the United States were so mixed up over, you know, people don't even know that history. But in the well, one other thing that occurred to me is, you know, nationalism, nations, I think, are considered like a, you know, 19th century invention with you know, around the time of the Puebla battle, and that, you know, that's when nation states began forming, with some roots earlier in the 18th, 17th, and even medieval times. But, you know, I was wondering, well, where does this idea come from? And I quickly tried to Google it before we got on. I couldn't find anything good. But, you know, one thing that occurs to me is that back to the Jews, since our history is so ancient, you know, I wonder if the concept of like Zion and Zionism, you know, from thousands of years ago, not the modern Zionism, but the idea of like of a land, of a people associated with a land, is maybe, if this, it would be interesting to look into, to what extent is nationalism Jewish, or originates in Jewish history. You know, I don't know if it goes back beyond I mean, I don't know I can't remember who came first, the Egyptians or the Jews, or you know, how that happened. But our people have been involved in this forever, practically. And one thing I find really fascinating about that is, of course, the second most famous border in the world now, or maybe the first most famous, you know, prior, now that the Berlin Wall is down, would be in Israel. And what's interesting to me, one thing that's interesting to me is, and there's so many thoughts I have about this, but is how the state of Israel is kind of about, well, it's about identity, you know? And, you know, the creation of that border is about, in a way, preserving the Jewish identity as separate and distinct from the surrounding people. Whereas American Jews, and you kind of, I think, you know, you kind of said something that shows how you were part of this, and I am, are kind of, in some ways, the opposite, that the history of Jews in America is all about assimilation. And in some ways, we've been the most successful, you know, among the most successful in some ways, like, and this was another quote from this past week where the Israeli blasted the Russian foreign minister. He said, "Wise Jewish people say that the biggest anti-Semites are the Jews themselves," which was, of course, but in reading some other thing I heard, I don't know if you've read this, I'm jumping around.
I read it, yeah.
I don't know if you've read this article, I just read it this week, called "The Problem with Jewish Museums." And
no, I didn't read that.
Well, and they use the word self-abnegation, which is kind of like a polite way of saying, like a you know, the more extreme way would be Jews are anti-Semitic or self-hatred. But there is, you know, part of our history of assimilation is we want to mix in, and in some ways we do not want to be different. And the way it shows up in Jewish culture, according to this article, which was fascinating, is that when you look at that there's, he kind of says there's two kinds of museums. There's the Enlightenment Museum, which are the comprehensive universalist museums that are the famous ones that we know around the world. And then there's this modern type of museum called an identity museum, you know, and he says of all the identity museums, the Jewish museums all over the world are the only ones that are kind of like, that aren't they call them, he calls them an identity museum wary of identity. You know, I feel like the trauma of the Holocaust, but I don't think it started there. It's the trauma of the history of the Jewish diaspora has made us, well, you know, it's kind of given us a special relationship to borders, I think, where we want to avoid borders because we've been on the kind of wrong side of them for thousands of years. And so, but part of that is that we've become invisible even to ourselves. And one way that shows up is, as an example, you call yourself a white guy, and I'm going on, I'll stop in a second, but I want to say one more thing, because these are like pet peeves.
You're not really, you're white, but not white. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you know, I'm part of this, I like this progressive Jewish group called Lab Shul, and they had a Haggadah for this year's Passover Seder, and I ordered it, and I started reading it, and it was written by an African-American Jewish guy, and he basically said, you know, Judaism is not a race, and you've got to decide, you need to say what race you are in addition to being a Jew. And that idea drives me nuts. And I mean, although I understand it, it's part of the kind of borderlessness, or on the border where Jews find. And one thing I wanted to say about the border is not only a place where we distinguish one people from another. You know, the border is not just a separation, but it's a connection. And in fact, there is no such thing as connection without border. Mm-hmm. So, you know, key to a border is connection. And and the thing about Jews is we, for thousands of years, considered ourselves a race, and just for the last 50 or so have kind of downplayed that, and not just Jews, but the non-Jews, and have kind of accepted ourselves as white. And on the one hand, I can kind of fully understand many arguments for doing that, but I also feel that that's part of the self-abnegation and the assimilation, and it's not the whole truth. And, you know, I was thinking, you know, the difference between us, let's say, and African Americans, is that they can't assimilate the way we can assimilate, because we can call ourselves white. And then I realized that's not true. You know, what this is it's passing. And anyone can do it, you know, to a degree, depending on their physical features. And the question is, do Jews want to pass? I mean, is that what we're doing?
That's such a good question.
Anyway, too much to say, sorry.
No, it's great. I think, man, so many things you brought up, and we could talk for a really long time about just all of that. A Jewish guy I interviewed for another project, the Sharing Project, was exploring sharing. David Graeber, he's got this brilliant new book.
I read his book. Yeah.
Okay. So he was talking about some of the things you were just talking about in terms of the idea of the Native American critique of European society, in terms of, you know, how can we allow all this poverty with so much wealth? And it's also connected to the idea of land ownership. So I think, you know, in order to talk about, once that critique, so there are a couple things. Once we have if we don't think about the idea of land ownership or property in the same way, I mean, there's property, but owning land and this is our land, then we can't think about nation states in the same way that we think of now, which are rooted to the land as opposed to a group of people staying together. And I think the Native American critique, and this is in that book and it's in others as well, but talking about how
What's it called? The something everything?
the dawn of everything.
Dawn of everything.
Yeah. And really
Fabulous.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, things shook up after that critique because, the kings and queens and maybe even the Pope, like some of the authority, was questioned and losing power. So it became what's going to replace that, and became the secular nation state. And I mean, from my vantage point, as not a historian, that seems sort of,
well, the one thing word you're not saying that was integral to it is that's when, the 19th century is also when capitalism developed, and the whole idea of private ownership.
right.
This was hand in hand with the system of capitalism, which is what,
Right.
which is
You
how
know,
it fits together.
Right. And that's connected to, I mean, you can start with the Dutch and and we read about the tulip craze, and we can read about the slave trade and its connection to sugar and cotton and all of that. So, and then the racism connected to that, and exploitation and genocide of Native Americans and all of these things. So yeah, I mean, and then now we're, and Graeber talks about that too, right? Like how this, just assuming that there's only one way to structure societies that are, and there isn't, there's like all these different ways. So, okay, I'm trying to say what my feeling is, there's huge amounts of complexity here. And I also think as a Jewish guy, I think there's huge amounts of complexity in relationship to all this too. I mean, on the one hand, as you were saying, there's a really long history. I mean, and for my family too, basically even sort of rooted in Hungary, but not rooted in the same way as other Hungarians might have been. And this idea of rootlessness and wandering. I mean, there's the whole, idea, it's like the wandering Jew, like that famous phrase. And because a lot of Jews were not allowed, mostly a lot of Jews were not allowed to own land, right? So who owns the land? So the idea of land ownership, but no, not the Jews. And so there's this idea, and for thousands of years, this idea of like not having a land, but then thinking about Israel as the land for Jews. So I think, on the one hand, you get people, and so you get a huge diversity of opinions about what one is supposed to do. On the one hand, you might have someone like Marx, who's like, talking about kind of globally banding together as workers, and then you might have a more like Zionist approach like Theodor Herzl, and this idea of like returning to the land and working as farmers when Jews weren't allowed to do those things really. And so, and then, the idea of being persecuted, which Jews have been persecuted so terribly for so long, the Inquisition we mentioned, the Holocaust we were talking about, but it's way longer and way forever. And now, okay, so now I don't see it to the same degree at all as obviously that, like the Inquisition, and certainly not the Holocaust, but it seems from my vantage point that Jews, Israelis, the government, it's not Jews or Israelis, the Israeli government as a whole, there's lots of Jews who believe there should be a Palestinian state and it should be divided up in a fair way. But there's wall there, there's persecution, the Israeli government is not acting, in my vantage point, the way that we should be collectively. And I'm talking about a Jew, there's Jews there, but I'm talking about the idea of we, like as a global citizen, in the same way that we here have not been acting properly in terms of our treatment of refugees here with our detention centers here. And I'm not in the government. And I didn't vote for Trump. That's pretty obvious, but we're all still complicit, I think, for everything that's happening to some degree. So I just think then in terms of the idea of race, I just think all these things are really complex. For me, I just feel like one thing that I was learning at the border, I was thinking a lot about it in the border, looking at these walls, the big border wall, and then the walls at the detention center, and thinking about the walls in our gated communities. And then you were talking about this sort of like, this idea of like holding on to what we have, whatever wealth that we have. You see this is a wealthy country, a lot of wealth in these gated communities, and trying to keep others away. And so much of this has to do with economics, and also a question of like, how generous are we acting, because it's a question about compassion and generosity and ethics in my mind. So I just think,
and it's a question of borders and difference. So
yeah,
if,
there's also that,
I just read that the US, I don't know what the number is, but it's apparently, I think the equivalent of 2/3 of the Russian military budget, the US is investing in sending weapons. It's an enormous, and I can't help but see the racial component to this.
right?
That if Mexicans spoke English and were considered white,
Right.
Or Canadians, let's say, they were more like Canadians,
Right.
Look at the difference. No one's talking about building a wall between us and Canada, even though there's probably, I don't know, but I'll bet you the cross-border activity with Canada is similar to what it is with Mexico.
Yeah.
And, and of course, this is so complicated because, of course, being of Hispanic origin is not considered a race. And, I'm part of this spiritual group where the head guru is Kuwaiti. And the spiritual group, unfortunately, is very, very lacking in diversity. And this guy always says, what are you talking about? I'm a person of color. And just look at me. And as a way to justify the lack of diversity in the organization. And I'm like, don't you know? Do you really not know that you're officially considered a white person? Anyone from the Middle East is considered white in the United States. Jews and Arabs and everyone. So we have it's very arbitrary what is considered race.
Yeah.
My girlfriend is from Colombia, and so her first language, Spanish is her native tongue, and I live in New Jersey where it's majority Latino. If I go to any store on the corner or anything, they mostly speak Spanish. And, my daughter speaks Spanish as a second language. I don't, but, when you listen to Kay Ivey, she's like, no way, Jose, we're not going to be learning Spanish. And, this is like a visceral, this is about border, it's about polarity. It's about, we're not them,
Totally.
They're not us. And that's not our language. And it's funny. It's like in some ways, the American Jew is the opposite of that. In some ways, we've tried so hard to not be different. It's like, okay, you don't speak Hebrew, we'll speak English, or like I barely had any Yiddish in my household because they had their traumas and didn't want to be seen as different. And
yeah, I hear you.
Well, and I also can sympathize with how annoying it can be to not be able to communicate with someone who's speaking Spanish in my neighborhood. And why am I saying all that? Just and I'm talking more than you are.
No, no, it's great. So yeah,
that is so complicated, and I guess I would love to see you make a second film where it's about where the engagement is with the other side of the border, which is the people that are afraid or angry, are it's like if we come to common ground with the people that want those detention centers, or that with the reasons for why those detention centers are there. I don't know, this country, I'm very pessimistic about where things are going. We're just talking to ourselves. Okay.
So, well, okay, it's really good. There's so many points there. The race thing, for sure. I mean, first of all, the idea of whiteness is a construct. Who's considered white at different times changes. Feel lucky in a way that Jews in this country are considered white. I don't think it's the case in Hungary, or not in the same way at all. It's very much other. And I think the idea of otherness changes all the time. And the march in Charlottesville was, yelling about killing Jews and Black people didn't seem like Jews were labeled as white in the same way at all. It's very much other. I think our treatment, you're right. I mean, so true. Like what's happening in Ukraine is terrible. The response to it, the enormity of the response to it is much different than the refugee crises that are happening elsewhere, like in different, in Africa, or what's happening in south of the US border here. And I think it's true. If these were white Canadians needing help, then I think the response would have been totally different. And I do think it's connected to this idea. I think there's this tension in this country between this idea of this being a place that celebrates diversity, because it really is this place of immigrants from all over the place. And this idea of, no, this is a white Christian country and this kind of white nationalism. And I don't believe in that. I mean, not just because I'm not Christian, but just because I love this idea of this melting pot. And I guess that's an idea of assimilation, but I think there's different versions of that. And I think there's a version of being part of a larger culture that's also proud of one's roots and acknowledges one's roots and one's culture. And so, I foreground my Jewishness in my work, and, and even in my bio and my website, I'm proud of the rabbis in my ancestry. And I think there's room I think there's room to be proud of one's heritage and one's culture, and also to be accepting of others and difference. And so I think, it's the same thing for like someone who's like 50 generations from Ireland and is Catholic, like, be proud of that culture, but also celebrate others as well. And I think that's the best version of our country. I totally agree with you. I mean, one of the things I was trying to do at the border, and I hear you, those stories are not shared in the film as much. And maybe I should make a second version that foregrounds some of those other conversations and additional ones. But I really do believe in this idea of interacting with people with different perspectives. And that was a big part of what I was trying to do down there. I just didn't foreground those in that movie, and maybe I'll do it in another movie, because I really was, and we were really getting into things. And that actually, I saw so much trauma there, but one of the things that gave me hope was people do value this idea of connection and community. And there is a big part of, I think, everyone I was talking to that does believe, at least at some level, this idea of diversity and freedom of expression and freedom of conducting one's lives in different ways. And just talking with people and trying to bridge the gaps between things. I felt really hopeful about that. And it's also sort of similar in a way. I like, I grew up in Boston and in Brookline, as you mentioned, and then I was in LA, and those, they're very progressive parts of this country. And I love living in both of those places, but I also really enjoy being in North Carolina. And one of the reasons why I like being in North Carolina is I can hang out with people and, go get a meal or go to a party with some very staunch conservative positions, and we get into things and we talk about it and we argue about it, but in a friendly way and in a similar way that just gives me hope. Something I also try to do in my teaching, I just really feel like conversation, maybe it's because we're on social media too much, maybe it's because we're not hanging out in the park or unfiltered, like unstructured play as much as kids, or just in general, or we have to learn how to talk and argue and be with each other and converse. And so I sort of feel like it's something I've had to emphasize a lot more and try to really be intentional about, okay, how do we talk and how do we disagree and how do we talk in the room all together? And you don't necessarily need to raise hands. I don't like doing that in my classes, but can we just interact with each other, really hear each other, really listen, respond to each other? And I think it's hugely important. And so I'm totally with you there. And I think, democracy, that's how democracy works. I think this country's is very capable of that. I think we may have lost our way a bit. There was an article in the Atlantic recently that did blame a lot of this on social media and the share button specifically, and how it amplifies sort of division a little bit more. And I think it's important to be able to interact with people and try to think beyond party and definitely beyond race or neighborhoods or whatever. And really for us to we have so many problems, let's try to solve them together, and talking with each other, and including what you're doing with this podcast, creating conversation in this way, I just think is really important.
Yeah, well, thank you. And maybe we could just leave it there, although I have so much more to say and I'm curious to learn more. So we might have to revisit, but how can people find out more about what you do and your film and what's going to show next?
Yeah, so I encourage people to go to borderball.net, and there's updates there on the next movie screenings. Hopefully, I'll have a public distribution soon, like some of my other films, like my film Sycamore, for example, is on Amazon and on Canopy. The Sharing Project is also easily found and streamed on. And so I have a website, joeltauber.com, with other projects, borderball.net for that project. I'm on social media too, and Twitter at Joel Tauber, and
so it's JOELTAUBER.com. That's where they can find everything.
That's where they can find everything, joeltauber.com. And I want to say something about Borderball too. There's on that website, there's links to how people can engage and learn more about what's happening, and also to get involved. There's links about information, and there's the map from Freedom for Immigrants, and that talks about where there's detention centers happening all over this country. There's the Global Detention Project that's mapping what's happening all over the world. And there's links to get involved actively, volunteering or contributing in other ways to Freedom for Immigrants. There's a link for people to share stories. We're gathering stories on Tumblr for people to share stories about borders and immigration, to tell more stories than are in this project. And so there's a bunch of material on borderball.net and other projects, joeltauber.com.
This relates very deeply with my work.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a whole theory about this stuff.
Well, I would love to hear more about that.
One thing I could say is, what in writing my last book, I kind of came to realize that change
Yeah.
a function of difference. In other words, there is no change without difference, and there's no difference without change.
That's good. Yeah, that's really nice. I hear you.
And
Yeah.
what's more profound is there's no meaning
Hmm.
without change, without difference.
Hmm.
That if you, and you have to read my book to see the logic.
Yeah, I want to read it.
There can't be meaning without difference. So the fact that the border issue generates so much controversy and so much deeply felt meaning, in some ways, is all about people's relationship to change. And, people wanting to go back or to go forward, people wanting to stay different or to merge,
Yeah.
and that's where and identity is
Mhm.
at the, is identity is what's different.
Yeah. That's really good. I look forward to, yeah, I want to chew on that more. And I totally hear you. And I look forward to exploring that in your book.
It's part of the human condition. This is not fixable. It's forever, I mean, we can change our relationship to, we can change the animosity and our behaviors, but this kind of, I think this part of this is so, I call it the first technology, is our ability to differentiate things. And
Yeah. Otherwise, it's just a giant lump, right? Like,
otherwise everything is one.
Yeah.
I mean, the alternative is in some ways enlightenment. All is one, all is
right.
eternal.
It's both, right? It's
Yeah.
both. It's both. All is one, and everything is super differentiated.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it's like, to get away from it, you got to enter the non-dual. And as soon as you're in duality, you've got this whole mishmash of meaning generation that's dependent on these differences.
Mhm.
Anyway.
Yeah, that's really good. I hear you. All right, I'm going to chew on that. It was really great talking with you.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Ben. I appreciate being on your podcast and getting to talk with you and getting to know you. So it's been a joy.
Thank you, Joel Tauber, artist, activist, filmmaker.
Great talking with you, Ben. I'll see you later. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Nature Breakthroughs podcast with Dr. Wild Ben Goldman to discover what you need for personal, organizational, and societal change. Get your free download of 3 ancient rituals smart entrepreneurs use to bounce back from shifts in the market and inside themselves. Go to www.naturebreakthroughs.com.